Many people out there believe the Mediterranean diet is the healthiest way to eat. Where did this idea come from?
Where did this idea come from? I've gone right back in history, Jesse. I've got a funny story. I'll share this really quickly with you. I have been speaking about the blue zones, as you know, and I had a guy here in Australia, Dr. Peter Bruckner, come to one of my talks last year. And he is a exercise sports physician, and he was the team doctor for the Australian cricket team. He's been very high profile here in trying to advocate for low carbohydrate, healthy fat principles, reducing sugar, ever since he worked it out when he was the team doctor. And so after seeing my talk, he asked me if I'd come onto a Facebook live stream and talk about the blue zones. And I said, oh, yes, I'd love to do that. And then about 2 weeks out, all of a sudden the advertising started saying I was talking about the Mediterranean diet and had olive oil and all these things. Like, far out. I haven't actually done a big study on the Mediterranean diet. I had 2 weeks. And I think because Nina Teicholz, Gary Taubes, Zoe Harcum have done such an amazing job pulling apart so many elements of Ansel Keys's work and Zoe Harcum with the 22 countries, which became the 7 countries study for Ansel Keys, and an understanding that cholesterol is vital to our body. Her work's just beautiful. And I mean, oh my gosh, I don't want to go down that same pathway that everyone else has spoken about. I want to really look to see what I can value add to this talk and do it sort of in a similar way that I've done with my Blue Zones research. So as Winston Churchill says, the farther back you look, the farther forward you can see. So I decided to go even further back after understanding that Ansel Keys was using a lot of his data from a guy called Leland Orber, who'd gone to Crete in 1948 with the Rockefeller Foundation. They had wanted to see what was happening in this war-torn country. And so, as I say, I just did this big deep dive and tried to understand so many things. As you know, the Mediterranean basin is huge. The Mediterranean Sea, it's bordered by 22 states that border or sit within it. And I think most people would understand, this is Southern Europe, Western Asia, Northern Africa, very, very different places. And people who live on the coast are more likely to access fish and seafood. People who live inland and in the mountainous areas rely on pastoralism and tend to eat a higher animal produce diet. And then, interestingly, Jesse, religion plays a huge part in the Mediterranean diet that we understand. Because if you think about it, half of the countries bordering the Mediterranean identify as Muslim. So Islam and Judaism, Israel is also there, they prohibit pork. And yet all of the Christian nations, the other half, use it as a dietary staple. So we have that real disconnect right from the outset of banning pork and eating it as a dietary staple. Catholicism covers about 7 of the countries. And as I mentioned previously with my Blue Zones talk, with Catholicism, that's avoiding warm-blooded animals. So they're allowed to eat fish and shellfish in religious fasting. It isn't as strict as Greek Orthodox, which covers Greece, Montenegro, and Cyprus. And within those countries, they're not allowed to eat red-blooded animals. And, well, it's probably worth mentioning it again in case people don't watch the first one, that red-blooded animals have hemoglobin in them, an iron-based protein that allows transportation of oxygen in vertebrates. But in religious fasting in Greek Orthodox ideology, they were allowed to eat bloodless animals. And back when the canons were written, bloodless animals were actually anything that had blue blood, which we've now discovered, and that's hemocyanin. So it's a copper-based protein, and that allowed them to eat shellfish, squid, octopi, mussels, and snails. So it wasn't no meat, even though we've often been told they're plant-based and it's pretty much a vegan diet when they're fasting. looking from the outside in, I mean, of course you're going to believe it. I've got no idea until I started really looking and understanding it. So for 120 to 180 days a year, people in Ikaria, in the Blue Zone, and people in Crete, which is the global epicenter of the Mediterranean diet, they fast from red-blooded animals, but they can still eat shellfish, squid, octopi, mussels, and snails. And snails were so important in Crete, like in Ikaria, because a lot of the time, especially during the war, World War II, these people were pushed inland. And so snails were really all they could rely on as their protein to be able to eat, apart from plant-based protein. So it was a really, really important part of their diet for that fasting. But after fasting, there's always feasting. And that's what a lot of the information that we hear over and over, we don't find out about. We don't understand that all of these things, pigs, goats, sheep, the milk, the cheeses, not so much the milk, sorry, the cheeses, the yogurt, all of those things come back onto the table. So where did we get this messaging from? I think Leland Orber is a really interesting place to go back to, because when he went to do his study in 1948, when he went to look at Crete to see how it was recovering from war, and I'll just mention something like there's different numbers, but anything between 6 and 25,000 civilians were killed in Crete, and this was due to war, due to executions, due to starvation, which was a big way the Nazis took over, and they either pilfered their animals or they slaughtered them. They decimated crops or they requisitioned them, and these people were pretty much starving. So when he came in 1948, when Leland Orber came, he was recording rationing, post-war rationing. He named sugar, he named wheat flour and said half of it was imported. He named rice and said all of it was fully imported in their diet. And when he spoke to people, some of them had a goat, but this goat often lived in the house with them for protection. And he mentioned that livestock numbers were up to 30% below pre-war levels, and swine and poultry in particular, because they often feed on kitchen scraps, their numbers were sharply reduced, severely, sharply reduced, because there wasn't food for them. And so we're looking at a time, a place in time that was affected by religious ideology and fasting, and also by a lack of food post-war. And going on through some of his other things that he was saying, he said that 1 in 6 families said that they didn't have enough food. One family in particular stated that they were hungry all of the time. And then this data, which was published in 1953, was referred back to by Ancel Keys. So it confuses the messaging even more. And then when Ancel Keys did his study I think he had a sabbatical in 1951 to 52, and he visited Italy and Spain and Crete to look to see what was happening with people. He was really wanting his cholesterol hypothesis to take off, his idea that saturated fat was causing heart disease. And so if he went there then only a few years after Leland Orber had visited in this post-war period. So I can't imagine in 3 years it's improved dramatically. There's no electricity on Crete in any of the villages at that point in time. And the transport, a lot of the roads had been bombed. And so it was a very difficult life at this point. And then he came back, I think, in the 1957 and visited Crete 6 times then. So we're talking 10 years later. But Leland Orber had also noted in his publication that came out in 1953, he'd also noted that the average age of death was 48 in Crete in 1948. So we're talking about a lot of people had died. He sometimes talked about visiting generational homes, but the generational home might have only had 3 people in it. So it could have been a child, a mother, and a grandmother for all we know. How many men, how many physically capable men, or how many elderly men had been killed, and women and children in that time. So the average age of death was 48, and average life expectancy was 55 or 56, compared to America, the average age of death, I think, was 58 or 59, and the average life expectancy was 67. So it wasn't as good as America, and yet here it was being held up as this model diet. When Ancel Keys came back in, say, in 1957, he said that cretins had the lowest rate of cardiovascular disease. And he believed that was because 37% of their diet was olive oil. But in that's 10 years, how old were the people that he was studying? Were they elderly? Or had these people, and a lot of people died post-war. So those numbers weren't even included. As I said before, they might have died from dysentery. They died from wound infections that don't count as the actual war period, but affected them afterwards. And malaria and TB were also a big impact on health. In Greece, in particular on the mainland, hundreds of thousands of people died from post-war complications. So it just makes me wonder. And then it was noted by a couple of investigators who, one of them had actually spoken to someone who was part of Ancel Keys's original investigation, and they acknowledged 60% of people were fasting for Lent from his dietary survey that he actually conducted.
Coming back to the top of this story, Leland, 1948.
Yes.
What was his initial goal of going there? What inspired that?
Okay, that's really interesting. Okay, so we're going to jump back a little bit more and think about the fact that since ancient times, powerful civilizations have tried to capture trade and transport routes within the Mediterranean basin. It was a very, very powerful place. And Crete in particular, it was occupied by empires, rebels, saints and conquerors. And in 1869, the Suez Canal opened up. And in 1940, that's why Hitler wanted it. He wanted to come in and have access to that Suez Canal. I wonder if Rockefeller started sending Leland Orber and other people to do malarial control after the First World War. So he started sending people in the 1930s to try to modernize and eradicate malaria. But they sent people in to restructure a lot of these third world countries or countries that had been badly damaged by war. And then there was a debt. And then that debt enabled them to have access to places. Now, that's a theory. I'm wondering if part of that was due to it. But by sending Leland Orber into Crete, they wanted to work out how to modernise it. They wanted to give this report back to Greece, to the government, the administration there, to work out how they could improve the road structures, how they could improve electricity, how they could improve food production. And so it was an undernourished area that needed modernisation. That's what Leland Orber's takeaway was from this. So I'm still trying to research and do more information on that, but that's where I think it's coming from, Jesse.
Okay. So Leland went in first.
Mm-hmm.
Shortly after, Keys comes in.
Yes.
Did the two of them work together at all?
No, I don't believe they ever worked together. But Keys accessed a lot of this information and used data from Leland Orber's report within his research that he published later on. It was part of the referencing. So then I've got to, now we jump all the way forward and we look at a woman called Antigone Kouros Blazos, and she worked with Antonia Trikolopoulou, who Nina Teicholz has talked about quite a lot, working with Walter Willett and Greg Drescher in designing the Mediterranean diet with, up into the 1990s and this health halo that they put around it. But Antonia worked with Antigone Kouros Blazos and Mark Wahlquist. Now here is a neatly tied package. Mark Wahlquist was the expert witness on Gary's case here in Australia. So they were designing the Mediterranean Diet Score, which has been used by about 90% of Mediterranean diet research ever since. They were designing the score in the 1990s. And this concept, they were looking back at Ansel Keys's food dietary questionnaire, reinterpreting it 30 years later in the 1990s, published in the 1995, and not acknowledging religious ideology, the fasting, not acknowledging that he was looking at people during Lent, not acknowledging that it was really still post-war that he was going and examining these people. And then they created this Mediterranean diet score, Jessie, and when you go through it, it's got 8 pieces for the scorecard. And they talk about the 8 elements of the scorecard as how much meat, obviously, how much saturated fat, how much olive oil, how much legumes, and even they include wine within this scorecard. But they mentioned in their documentation, in their actual published research, not in the fine print, but you have to go digging to say that only 40% of people that they studied in the 1990s for this part of this paper, so they'd done the med score and then they worked on it to see if it actually correlated and worked, and only 40% of elderly Greeks, less, so it wasn't even that, 40% of elderly Greeks didn't even reach statistical significance of eating their so-called traditional diet. They only qualified for 3 or less of these 8 on the scorecard. And then they never tell whether that was because they ate meat or they ate animal fats. Doesn't talk about whether it was because of wine. Doesn't actually say what that part was. But this research and this Mediterranean diet score has been used by 90% of the Mediterranean diet research ever since. And that just blows my mind. Also, they acknowledged within this publication that fish and olive oil did not achieve significant statistical significance, and it was legumes that apparently appeared to be the thing that was contributing to health and longevity. So here we've got this paper, and yet somehow olive oil has become sanctified. It's become this amazing thing, and it didn't even achieve statistical significance within their paper in 1995.
I want to come back to this idea. You mentioned 22 countries, part of the Mediterranean.
Yes.
We've been focused on Greece. How do they become tied in? And how much research has been done outside of Greece?
Crete became the diet. A bit like Loma Linda when I've discussed the blue zones. And we've gone through all the blue zones, and then suddenly they take away what was being eaten in all of these traditional places or all of these ancestral communities and just focus in on Loma Linda. And that becomes the health halo of the blue zones. That becomes the diet. The plant-based diet comes from Loma Linda. None of the others were plant-based. They ate plants, but it wasn't a plant-based diet. I believe from the 7 countries study, it really suited Ansel Keys's hypothesis to say that animal protein and fat was bad, or particularly animal fat at the time. Cholesterol was causing heart disease. And so by using Crete, where they had such strict fasting practices, he was able to go there and see a lot of people who did not eat any animal protein or fat. Because remember, it's red blood, so it's not even fish. It's a very strict diet during that time, but once the fasting is over, then there's feasting. So I think it was held up as the diet because it suited. So he went to other countries for sure, 22 countries originally, and then dropped it because they weren't apparently suiting the hypothesis. But he narrowed it down to 7. But I still believe, just like the blue zones, that he cherry-picked the bits that he wanted out of places, and Crete became the model diet. And this is where all of the Mediterranean diet refers back to Crete, Crete, Crete.
Do we know where Keys initially came up with the hypothesis and what his motivation was behind that?
As I say, I haven't done a huge amount of research into Ansel Keys because so many other people have. I believe there were 2 factions debating, I guess, the heart disease in the 1960s. So Professor John Yudkin was at the Queen Elizabeth College in London, and he believed refined sugar and high fructose corn syrup was the culprit. Whereas in America, Ansel Keys was arguing about the cholesterol hypothesis. He was defending it hugely. Now, I think we spoke a little bit about the idea that for food industry, which was in particular Fred Stairs' Harvard School of Public Health was being bankrolled by Kellogg's and the food industry and canning, tin canning. His father actually owned the Continental Canning Company, I believe, and Harvard owned millions of shares in the company. So we're talking about an idea that if you blame saturated fat for harm, then you minimize the harms of sugar. And this idea, I believe, came through funding and came about because he had this idea. He'd done a lot of starvation diets. And I guess when you put people on these starvation diets, they weren't eating saturated fat. They weren't eating animal fat. They weren't eating a lot of protein. They weren't eating a lot of anything. And so his starvation diet sort of moved across to this. But I truly believe there was a lot of funding in this space to minimize the harms of sugar and make animal fats the scapegoat. And if you look at John Yudkin, he asked to take some time off, or he actually resigned from his position, but he had a conversation with the college about keeping his area to keep doing some research because he wanted to write his book, Pure, White and Deadly. And that was in 1971. But they reneged, and instead they employed someone who had a devout belief in Ansel Keys's cholesterol hypothesis. And so he was inserted into this position, and John Yudkin lost any use of the space. But it was really, really bad news for Australia. And the reason was Stuart Truswell was trying really hard to pass on, in his exact words, pass on his enthusiasm to the establishment in Britain, but apparently they weren't moved. So he gave up trying to insert this cholesterol hypothesis in Britain, and he came to Australia and he set up he was the foundational chair of nutrition at the Sydney University here, and he was the one in 1979 who introduced the same dietary guidelines, dietary goals that you guys had introduced in 1977. He introduced them here in 1979. So Australia also completely embraced this idea that saturated fat was bad and sugar didn't really matter, because Sydney University has been called out over and over for their potential conflicts of interest with industry in minimising the harms of sugar. And so it's the same thing. And that's Ansel Keys's hypothesis that's come through. But as for a lot of information, you'd really need to talk to Nina and Zoe, because I've tried to create a different story and work around it that would suit, I guess, the research that I've been doing and bring a different conversation to the table.
Okay, so we've talked about Leland, we've talked about Keys, their work going all the way back to the 40s and 50s. We touched on the 90s. Let's come full circle and talk about Mediterranean diet today.
The Mediterranean diet today, I believe in some cases, the Mediterranean diet has been called out by so many people that there is becoming a little bit of hesitancy within that space. And I've seen the Blue Zones diet starting to be used by spokespeople for the Dietitians Australia here, and no doubt it's getting very big in America. But lifestyle medicine, which I spoke about in our last talk, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine was founded on the Loma Linda University campus in 2003 as the Christian Association of Lifestyle Medicine. Now, lifestyle medicine has its roots in Adventism. I think I talked about the fact that they merged with Coca-Cola, which didn't really make a lot of sense to me at the time, and they've gotten a lot of food and even they started to work with pharmaceutical. But I guess if you think about it, a plant-based diet, like a plate that's completely devoid of any animal protein or fat, is going to have to be supplemented. People actually can't, over time, be cured, Jessie. Yes, if you go onto a vegan diet and you've been eating a high-processed, highly refined diet that has a lot of sugar and carbs in it, and you move towards a whole food vegan diet, you can improve your health dramatically, and you'll see those results very quickly. but over time your body starts to become depleted of essential nutrients. And unless you keep supplementing and fortifying, and as I mentioned before, in the fine print of the Adventist Health Studies, they quantify vegetarians as eating meat, eggs, milk, cheeses. They can eat it once a week and still be a vegetarian, and they can be a vegan. In their food studies, they can be said to be vegan and still eating all of those things once a month, which isn't what the public would understand as being a vegan diet. But their plates do not show anything. There's not a single animal protein or fat on there. And I've been looking into lifestyle medicine. And here in Australia, they've tried to disentangle themselves a little bit, because obviously I've been speaking out about it since 2017 publicly, and questioning the foundations of it. They've got sister organisations around the world. And in 2018, 2019, probably even 2020, these sister organisations were still running all of their course content and all of their examinations through the American College of Lifestyle Medicine or the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine under the American umbrella. And so as I started to say to people here, yes, you might be saying you're not a devout Seventh-day Adventist group here in Australia, but if you're doing all your work through that, you're educating people here on this belief that animal proteins and fats are bad because of a religious ideology, not because of anything else. So interestingly, and going into this Mediterranean, we've got a woman here who's very high profile in promoting and researching the Mediterranean diet. And her work, Catherine Itsiopoulos, she is, of course, on the advisory board for the olive oil wellness industry here. And I think that's what Nina has called out over and over again with her work when she's been looking at people in the 1990s. You know, they've been on sponsored trips, and even journalists who came along were sponsored by the olive oil industry because that's what they wanted to highlight, despite Antigone Kouros-Blazos saying maybe it wasn't significant statistically. So Catherine Itsiopoulos is definitely olive oil, and anti-animal proteins and fats. She did a study in 2024, which Nina also referenced, and their study said that low carbohydrate diets caused diabetes. And she's also on the board of the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine here. So this is the tie between lifestyle medicine and their belief, their purpose, I believe. The underlying foundational mission is to demonize animal protein and fat. They might say, oh, a little bit of meat if it's lean is okay, but this is where they're moving people towards this idea that olive oil is sanctified, it's the Holy Grail, and meat's bad. Her study saying that low-carb diets cause diabetes, when you look at it, she was saying that a low-carb diet was 187 grams of carbs per day or more. And in our world, there's no way. Like, a low-carb diet is at least under 120, if not under 50, if not under 30 for people who are quite serious about going very low-carb. And so that makes no sense. Her diet wasn't low-carb at all, so it was conflicting. But she is on the board of a newly formed Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute. So they've started a brand new one, Jessie. And this Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute's mission, when it was developed a couple of years ago, it was 2023, I think, it just reminded me of Nina's work. And here we had, postcard pictures of beautiful Aegean waters and, dancing and plant-based foods and all sorts of things happening. It was invitation only, and they were there to redefine the Mediterranean diet, to bring it under the umbrella of lifestyle medicine. It's like, what? Anyway, I started to look more and more into this, and I believe that lifestyle medicine as a whole, because there's been a lot of calling out. So the American College of Lifestyle Medicine is still very prominent in America. It's got a lot of influence around the world in these global sister organizations. A lot of them quite a few of them, I should say, have been started by devout Seventh-day Adventists. Others have either people who are Seventh-day Adventists or plant-based because of ethical reasons or potentially financial reasons. Like, there's a whole range of things why people are promoting it. I'm not saying people are bad, it's just this is what it is. And when you look at the Australian one, because we're such a secular community here, they wanted to push away this idea that it's come from religion. And so the World Lifestyle Medicine Organization was formed a few years ago, but it came from the International Board of Lifestyle Medicine. It came from other things. It's just been renamed, and suddenly it's the World Lifestyle Medicine Organization, and the American College of Lifestyle Medicine isn't on it. But the World Lifestyle Medicine Organization events that happen with the countries that are signed up to it still highlight people from the American College of Lifestyle Medicine in their events. So they're still there. It's just the name's been taken away, I believe, so that the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine can tell me they're not there anymore. We're not part of it. But this Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute, I think they're wanting to go there for the British and the Australasian Society and a couple of the other societies that really want to distance themselves from the Adventist ideology but have complete belief in the idea of olive oil being sanctified. So this redefining is really lifestyle medicine wanting cultural legitimacy. Because if they can convince people that a cretin diet, especially during fasting, is completely vegan, so they're not eating very much animal protein at all or animal fats, it's minimal. You think, but no, this is nuanced. What religion would tell their members that they can't have nutrition, that they can't be nourished, even though they have to observe this long period of fasting, they're still allowed to nourish themselves. It's just in a different package. And yet the Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute they have published that Greek Orthodox fasting is completely vegan. It's just wrapping it all up into everything, Jessie. It's the blue zones. And again, the blue zones, the American College of Lifestyle Medicine is credentialing blue zone doctors. The Mediterranean Lifestyle Medicine Institute is talking about the blue zones because they're pulling in your car. It's just like, it is just so circular and so powerful. And if people don't understand where this is coming from, it's very hard to question it. And I just keep diving deeper. Why are we told this messaging over and over again?
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
I decided to go even further back after understanding that Ansel Keys was using a lot of his data from a guy called Leland Orber, who'd gone to Crete in 1948 with the Rockefeller Foundation. They had wanted to see what was happening.